For everyone, I would like to say welcome and thank you for coming to today, the second of 4 events on delivering WETO. I will just share the screen so that you can hopefully see, and we'll get ready to make a start. I can see some faces and names from last week, so it's good to see you back. We're hoping today to get through quite a number of activities where we can make ourselves more familiar with approaches to the questions and supporting candidates in achieving the very best they can across the assessment objectives. What I will do now when we work our way through the presentation, I will just take my face from view if you don't mind, but we will be having discussions later on and we'll be able to interact. As Leon has mentioned, your mic is enabled. If you could just keep on mute when we're not in activity sections. And you have 2 options of participation. You may contribute verbally, or if you're feeling a little bit shy, we do have the chat box function. And at the points where we're doing some activities, you can make comments and provide some feedback on your thoughts as we work our way through. So without further ado, we'll make a start, and welcome, a happy return for those from last time, and welcome to those who are new today. So I will just get ready to start with you. So today we are looking at setting the International A-Level English Literature in context. We're going to hopefully work our way through a closer focus on the assessment objectives. We'll be working with some questions from recent question papers and looking at examples of candidate responses. We hope to discover and review and consider strategies for teaching, and there will be an opportunity at the end for any pressing questions, and you may wish at that point to network with colleagues after the concluding message. So in our aims, we hope to discuss some of the assessment objectives in further detail. We will analyse some questions and think about how those can be matched to the objectives when we're encouraging students in their performance. We'll look at, through marking, how questions have been answered in the past and think about feedback from the examiner's reports. We'll think about strategies for teaching to highlight and foreground those objectives that students perhaps find challenging through time. And then hopefully there'll be chances and opportunities to discuss and share best practice with each other. Firstly and foremost, I'd like to welcome you to Pearson today. Pearson Edexcel, the world's leading learning company and the largest awarding organisation in the UK, and developing with schools across the globe. You can see the numbers there. We're looking at 3.5 million students a year with a heritage going back over 150 years. So there is sort of much experience to be drawn from. Looking at our particular qualification today, English literature, thinking about in general, we're building on those knowledge, skills and understanding from GCSE and international GCSE. The international A-level does bear similarities for those of you who also teach the UK domestic qualification, and in fact some of the resources may be interchangeable. We're trying to blend knowledge and skills in an integrated way, and we'll be looking at the idea of coherence, and particularly as we're moving through performance, the idea of cogency and bringing those things together in the student's personal response. This particular qualification can be taken in both a linear and a modular fashion, and we'll look at that briefly towards the end in terms of how that might affect planning or the ways that you want to deliver the qualification. But it's that flexibility that often centres appreciate. We're focusing on Unit 2 today, but just a quick overview of how this fits together. We had last week a focus on post-2000 poetry and prose. We'll be focusing with drama this morning. And then we have Unit 3, Poetry and Prose, with finally Unit 4, Shakespeare and pre-1900 poetry. And we can see there in terms of the raw marks, we've got that equal weighting across units. Looking at our assessment objectives, AO1, we are ultimately looking for those informed personal responses. We want to see candidates engage with texts, but through an informed use of concepts and terminology and accurately conveying those ideas about the texts they experience. We're thinking about analysing the ways in which writers write and how the meaning is shaped or created or ideas are presented in the literary texts. We're hoping candidates can demonstrate an understanding of the significance of the wider context in which the text has been written or in which the texts have been received. And it's thinking about working with those in particular focus with the questions that are asked on the paper. Hopefully, students will be exploring connections across literary texts, and we're thinking of the ways in which a text may be informed by different types of interpretations. And we can see just there, looking briefly at weighting, we have possibly the bulk of our weighting in AO1 to AO3, but we do then have that division between AO4 and AO5 for the final quarter of the AS marks. And for those doing the full A level, we can see it's 30, 30, 20, 10, 10. Today, as I said, we're focusing on Unit 2. And if we look at our AOs, we won't be focusing so much on AO4 today, but we can say that we have the AO1, AO2 balance, but note particularly that there is a slightly heavier weighting on AO3 and AO5. And I will be trying to kind of focus your attention on that today and the potential challenges it might bring for candidates. And then just a brief look across at how these percentages for the AOs weigh up for the full A level. So once again, we're thinking about questions, and in our 2, we're going to try and predominantly feature at AO3 and AO5. Our assessment objectives are used to achieve consistency, not just across our own units and qualifications, but with other qualifications in this subject. And it's so that fairness can be achieved and that there's a clarity of information provided for candidates in terms of what we are looking for and what we're hoping they can perform. We're thinking about our subject domain and that language that we need to use to analyse and evaluate what the writer might be doing. The assessment objectives also allow us to achieve validity and fairness in terms of eventual award. They can give us a reference point for various groups of people, whether it's those who set papers, examiners, teachers, and ultimately the candidates themselves. And we run this process, as we say, at the sort of the key examination points. So for today, we are working with Unit 2, and it's the drama paper. It's a 2-hour open book exam with 2 even sections, A and B, 25 marks for each. We're going to focus first on section A, which is the pre-1900 drama texts. And we can see our list here: Faustus, Othello, The Rover, She Stoops to Conquer, and Twelfth Night. Many of the tasks this morning will be focusing on Othello, as that is sort of quite a high proportion of entry, but there are ways that you can repeat the activities if you study a different textbook you centre. And certainly when we're feeding back to each other today, by all means, do reference other texts in your responses and in your comments. For the candidates and their chosen text, there will be 2 questions set and they will choose 1 from 2. And hopefully we'll work our way through some examples in the subsequent slides. Looking quickly at section B, again, we have then our 5 texts, and we'll be studying this after the break. And we have A Raisin in the Sun, Streetcar Named Desire, Death of a Salesman, Top Girls, and Waiting for Godot. And in section B, we will be looking at maybe more than 1 text to give some range. As in section A, 2 questions set, and the candidate chooses 1, essay-based responses. So looking then at section A, we're going to start by considering 3 questions. As I'm sort of talking through some of the issues that might be raised with both the prompt and the core question, you might think to yourself, if this was a discussion with your own candidates, either you personally, which question would you perhaps have chosen to do, or where might you have advised them to direct their attention? And if you've made that decision, you might be thinking as we consider how you might begin or end these responses in terms of stating a clear personal interpretation and then possibly clinching that argument or presenting a final evaluation in the end. And what we'll do is we'll look at the 3 questions first, and then there'll hopefully be opportunities for either verbal or chat box feedback, and we'll see if we have some different approaches emerging. So looking at this example, we have 2 aspects. We have the prompt, and you will notice the prompt as it is within either speech marks or inverted commas. And the prompt is there first to get the candidate to consider interpretations of a text and consider how that might reflect or challenge their own personal response. And there are words within that prompt that will help students develop a nuanced response. But if we look at the second bullet, this actually forms the core question. And we always have this format. There will be prompt, core question, and a reminder to consider the contextual factors. So in this case, the core question is asking about, in the light of the statement, explore how Shakespeare presents relationships between men and women. And a thing to note, obviously, is the word explore makes students think of evaluation. It's the presentation of relationship. So we're thinking of dramatic technique and use of language, for example, and it's relationships between the men and women. Coming back to the prompt, there are ways that we can interrogate the text further. There is the word foolishly, and at the higher levels, students will engage with that. To what extent do they think these characters have maybe been foolish in their underestimation of the female characters? Note as well that we're considering two aspects, both aspects of intelligence and or aspects of strength shown at different points in the play. And we will look at this further later in the session, but you find that as we move through the levels and as students present more effective performance, they do engage with the prompt as a way of illuminating their answer to the core. So it's using those together to create an effective personal response. In the second example, perhaps appears more straightforward. We have in Othello, even the play's most innocent characters are guilty of betrayal. So that is our prompt. And underneath we have the core question. In the light of the statement, explore Shakespeare's presentation of betrayal. And the prompt is there to help students consider all aspects or a greater range of characters. So they may engage with the idea of what do we mean by betrayal? What do we mean by guilt or innocence? And is it true that we feel a most innocent character may also be accused of betrayal? And that allows the students to engage in that nuanced evaluation of the presentation of those characters and the presentation of the theme. And once again, candidates are reminded of AO3, it must consider relevant contextual factors. Our third and final example for this activity appears at first to focus on the character of Cassio. And if we look at the prompt, Cassio is more than just a plot device. He illuminates the key ideas of the play. And the core question is, in the light of the statement, explore how Shakespeare uses the character of Cassio. And the key point to the question is uses. We're looking not merely at the idea of Cassio in terms of presentation of character, but his dramatic function, how he might drive the story forward, how he contributes to the conflict. And not only that, returning to the prompt, it's the fact that maybe we say he is more than just a device. He is a form of illumination of the key ideas. So what values might he symbolize and how might that be linked with thematic aspects? So thinking through those three, Cassio as plot device, we have betrayal and the most innocent characters, and we have representation of men and women. And if we could just use the chat function or use your mics are enabled. If you want to just give sort of a preliminary feedback, if this were your group of candidates, which question would you feel they may lean towards, or which question would you lean towards, and what way would you position the response, either in terms of openings or endings? So if you'd like to sort of share comments or thoughts in the chat box, or if you're feeling quite brave, you might want to pop your mic on and sort of share your thoughts with us. And it would be nice, it might be nice to hear from some of you or to see some of your thoughts on that. So you just take a moment or two, and if you'd like to share comments, and we'll see what we're thinking. I'll just pop the chat box on. And a reminder there from Leon that you can find your resources in the resources link through the More button, 3 dots, and then resources. And if not, there is a download link as well. We have, thank you, Claire. We're discussing the fact that maybe the confident student might enjoy engaging with the idea of to what extent we have our most innocent characters. Thank you, Novi. The sense of relationships and betrayal. Because I think you've made an important point there. Candidates can sometimes overlook words like use and maybe write about Cassio as a character rather than his sort of dramatic function. And likewise, men and women may sort of seem sort of an easy point to write on. And if we look back at the men and women, and the key there, I think, for students is maybe not to be deceived in thinking that it maybe is just a presentation of men and women and looking at that idea of the foolish underestimation, and that would take them to that idea of nuanced arguments. And we will be addressing issues of context as well. The fact that context needs to be in the answers, but it's how we do it. We're going to be looking at that and thinking about using significant context points to further our argument and to support our argument on presentation of men and women or function of Cassio or betrayal. So, for example, you might discuss cuckolding if you were doing the betrayal question. And is there anyone who has any sort of strong feeling of either a question that they might feel their candidates would avoid or a question they would be maybe concerned about in terms of approach? Any of you raised the issue about the Cassio question? And what we hope is that ideally we look at using the core question, making sure that if it is a presentation question, that is key and at the foreground. If it is a use question, it brings in dramatic function, and then not to ignore the prompt. The prompt is there to support the student in helping them develop a personal response. They don't necessarily need to agree with it, but they can interrogate it and work with it. And yes, I think Liz has said betrayal seems to be quite a popular one and something that the candidates probably have lots that they want to say about it. And the key thing is, as we say, because we're saying, possibly this question would cause them an issue or they would need to watch for these issues in terms of the use in the Cassio question. But it's worth sort of getting candidates to look at the past papers and think about the possibilities of the question. And yes, absolutely, Novi. It's the how, isn't it? It's the how is this done, and then the effects of that. And if they keep that in mind, they are definitely on the right track, aren't they? So they're always looking at how would this be done and what is the impact of that. And thinking about presentation of the how, as we've just said, hopefully they will have encountered some of these at IGCSE. And we're looking at things that appear in the spec. So certainly we talk about characterization, and we try at this level to get students to move beyond just discussing character in terms of characteristics, but that idea of presentation, how is it conveyed to the audience through both verbal and non-verbal. We're looking at the form and structure. That might mean discussing the play as a tragedy, or it might be at the micro level, looking at a particular scene or example and thinking about the techniques that Shakespeare is using at that particular point. Certainly, it might be relevant to talk about imagery, symbols, and motifs. And we would expect some development of language choices, although we are careful not to use a sort of word level approach. So we don't want to just maybe focus in on single words, but we're thinking about how they develop. For example, the degradation of Othello's language as the play progresses. Thematically, we are looking at theme, not just through language, but again through the dramatic presentation and tone and mood. And some candidates work very ably with the idea of stage direction or stagecraft, and in the case of Shakespeare, the case of the inferred stage directions through other characters' dialogues. And it's something that can be relevant and can form actually a crossover into AO3. So our specification says that students do need to consider and discuss how the playwright is using the form to evoke a response in the audience. And that can include, the audience's conventional expectations, for example, of a hero or a villain, and where those are challenged or subverted. It can be about the understanding of meaning at a certain point in a certain example they provide. it can be, we mentioned this idea of context. We want context to be in every answer, and it will look different in every answer. Sometimes it will be the context of dramatic performance. Sometimes it will be a social context that influences the understanding of a character's motivation or behavior at a certain point. I mentioned the idea of the cuckoldry and the jealousy that drives characters at certain points in time. We might look at the interpretation by audience and readers, and we'll see in a moment that candidates have actually become quite secure in discussing particular performances they've seen, whether live or on film or television adaptations, and using them in significant ways to answer questions. We also want to look at the way of constructing a critical argument, so a form of a thesis, and developing an idea throughout a response to get to those higher levels. And throughout, hopefully, students will use appropriate terms and concepts. So as we said, a real positive that's coming through with candidates, and with thank centres for this, is the strength of how students refer to stage versions. And it can be film and television, and some candidates are lucky enough to see sort of live versions. And we're thinking about, again, not describing them, but how they can be used as contextual information to feed into a reading or to feed into a personal response. So looking at the enrichment of this and the grasp of the material, and a key word here we have is the pertinent detail. So if material is included, it's pertinent to the question. One thing to consider today, and we asked this question with Unit 1, and certainly many centres said it was sort of a poem by poem approach, but it's possible approaches to teaching. So do we find in centres, are we front-loading main features, so looking at dramatic techniques in a range of extracts or a range of prior examples, maybe studied at a lower level, or are they covered as you teach your set text? You know, are you choosing Othello and addressing these as they come up naturally within the play? Or are you maybe making reference back to some IGCSE study, or even in some cases, some centres using extracts to introduce particular techniques before moving on to the main text? And yes, thank you. So you've said, for example, Neovi, you've mentioned that you introduced the conventions of tragedy before sort of beginning the text in earnest. And I think that's quite key, because genre, remember, can be a context as well. So genre sort of becomes a context that will and should underpin your answers. In terms then of advantages or drawbacks of models, are people finding that possibly it is quite a constraint on time to work with genre first and then text? Are people finding there's enough opportunities to bring out either generic concerns or dramatic function concerns as they work their way through the play? And again, you've said that some students don't have that IGCSE experience, and that's a key point too, if students are coming from different backgrounds. And Liz, you've mentioned that you've covered some of these and revising. And I think that's it, isn't it? It will be quite centre specific on whether your students have had a large experience of working with dramatic function, or whether this is quite sort of new to them to treat it as more than words on a page. So you've said you go through it first and then teach the features of the text. So it's interesting sort of how it works for everyone, and you find sort of a method that works best for groups. I find myself sometimes, even I think I had one year where I had two very different groups, and I found they responded in two very different ways. We used slightly different approaches even in the same exam session, so you can find that happens sometimes as well. A key point that was raised moving forward is planning these responses. We already said the core question is actually the second part of the response. The prompt that appears first is there to help engage with some key ideas and some ways of interpreting the text. And there is a lot happening, isn't there? We're going to look in a moment at another example. There are many facets to focus upon, and there are many things to engage a student or that they might want to interrogate. And therefore, it is quite important that they plan where they are going. They think about their arguments. You know, some people do use the word thesis, and they work their way through, not just thinking about examples that they might draw upon, but the shape of the argument and where they potentially might lie. And that's why earlier we mentioned not just how might you begin a response, but how might you finish a response? You know, how would you get yourself to that sort of final judgment? So we'll have a look at this with another question. So again, the same three-part structure. So the questions will follow this format. So our prompt is, despite their love for each other, Othello and Desdemona's relationship was always destined to fail. And our question is, in the light of the statement, explore Shakespeare's presentation of Othello and Desdemona's relationship in Othello. And certainly the core question itself would appear to be clear cut. It would appear to be certainly something we cover when covering the text, the idea of the relationship and the development or denigration of it. And then if we move back to the prompt one more time and thinking always of how we could include a contextual factor, we can look at a few things that we might want to debate. So that word despite could be a key word in terms of to what extent the student presents a personal response. So despite their love for each other. So we may have to outline where we see examples of their love. And then the sense of destiny or fate. The relationship was always destined to fail. And within that, the candidate might decide to what extent would I support this or to what extent would I challenge this prompt. And it's there, as we said, to help them engage at that more nuanced level so that we're not maybe just giving a description or a straightforward explanation of the presentation of relationship, but we are just interrogating it and evaluating, you know, to what extent it could be regarded as either a failure or a fact that there is some true love presented there. And we'll take this and we're thinking about brief plans. And this is one way that we can use the mark schemes. So your mark schemes will come in two elements for each section. We have our overall performance grids, and later I will be saying that we'll focus on that for marking activity because we're looking at performance across the AOs. And then we do have those content indicators. And while they are not exhaustive, while we always say that the candidate may, and in fact could present an alternative interpretation, they can be useful to use with your candidates as a form of revision aids. We can use that content list as a sensible starting point. We can ask students, you know, what would they add to it, you know, other pieces of information, other points of argument they might use. They might produce their own plans and peer review. They may add quotations and use flashcards to sort of test themselves on key elements they would put into the response. If we take the Othello and Desdemona's relationship, and these aspects have been drawn, as we said, from the 2406 mark scheme. So where you have the content indicators for question 9, you can use some phrases from those to develop this sort of basic skeleton plan. And if we're thinking about devices and AO2, the focus on diction, for example. So looking at any examples where you can see the presentation of either the love aspect or the presentation of the failure. The imagery and symbolism that occurs throughout the play. The dramatic techniques, I mean, here it mentions the idea of the use of the handkerchief. Any contrast and irony that the candidate might pick up upon. Form and structural devices, so looking at or maybe exploring a particular soliloquy or looking at any dramatic irony, and there's plenty of examples within the text. The candidate might draw on a critical response and use it as a form of context to help, you know, engage with that prompt a little bit further. So here we have an example about the idea of the commodification of the relationship. And if, again, we link it back to diction, where, you know, she's a jewel, she's a precious thing, she's a status symbol. And that could sort of be something that sort of enhances the response as well. And there's certainly room for improvement with this one. So it could be that we don't see enough AO3 coverage in this plan. And how could we address it actually? So that plan, as we say, what it's possibly missing is AO3. And what ways could we bring AO3 into this question about despite their love, it was destined to fail? There's some pieces of advice here. We could conflate with language. We could tweak a language bullet to include AO3. There's a tiny point there about use of AO5 as well, although we are trying to focus on AO3, which is that these general assertions of a such and such type of critic are not necessarily as successful as someone who's maybe engaging with critical reception. But context for, so if we just go back, we have a plan, but it's markedly lacking in context. If we look at the question. What types of contextual? We mentioned before tragedy as a context, so that's certainly one aspect of context we could regard. Any other ways that we could bring AO3 into this response in a meaningful way? Yes, we could look at the ideas of race and difference, and we could look back possibly at Act 1. Again, the idea of gender and female behaviour and status, and where, as you say, possibly Desdemona appears to challenge that earlier in the play, but then conform to it in a later stage, into victimhood. And we can look at, thank you, Liz, the military versus the domestic. You know, we have those two spheres throughout the text. And what we might even find in the higher level answers, we use this term, possibly this intersectionality. Many of these interact with each other or interconnect with one another. So Othello is having to work to prove himself because of those racial prejudices. We have his sort of military status versus his status as husband. We have the idea of gender and gender expectations, and they all sort of work together. And the best answers, the candidates can weave the AO3 throughout their response. You know, they're constantly thinking about the language used or the particular dramatic presentation with the bigger picture or the bigger canvas of all of these contextual aspects. And looking at other parts of the indicative content that we could have used and the ways of combining them. So we mentioned earlier, some of the language points could have been tweaked to potentially bring in the AO3. And where we can do that, we can encourage the candidates to interweave the AO3 throughout the response and not just sort of have it as a tag on or an add-on. So some ways that we could do it. You mentioned earlier that idea of the military versus domestic, and it might be brought in with a point about foreshadowing. You know, he must leave for Cyprus on his wedding day, and that would be a very key, a very pertinent example to back up the sense of the larger issue of the military versus domestic. We can have Brabantio as an example of both patriarchy and expected behaviour of his daughter. We've certainly got Iago presenting many of the contemporary prejudices around the marriage, and the students remember those quotes often stay in their mind. The soliloquy for the dramatic irony, and it's the sense of the destruction of this relationship. And remember, context is also the tragedy and the dramatic form, so that can also be part of AO3. There are comments again about, as we said, the racism, misogyny, and here they give a particular example of Kieran Ryan, and they're giving this example of how we can use this contextual reading to help sort of further the argument. So looking once again, another task about desire being a destructive force. And here we're thinking about asking the students to compile their own plans from scratch. So we could give them these steers and then ask them to complete the steers. So examples they could give of the diction, dramatic techniques, form and structure. And notice by saying first focus on context, second focus on context, we make sure that they're getting AO3 in there. And it can be a base of an actual essay, although do remind them it will need expansion, it will need development. So the examiner's report, and I know we are dwelling on AO3, but it has both the slightly heavier weighting, and it's something that candidates do grapple with. And the examiner report did say that we do still see a tendency with a few candidates to begin with the pre-prepared introduction. And what they do very often is they will give you the date, they will give you some historical detail, but it's not tied directly into the question. It's there, it's sort of describing the broader context in which the play was performed, but it's there at the start and it's not sort of doing any work in terms of showing the candidate's personal response or showing this awareness of how the context affects the play at every level. It affects the choices that Shakespeare has made with his language, it affects the way the audience is sort of interpreting the character or developing emotions towards the character. And we're trying to get candidates to avoid that technique, the technique of the bolt-on context. We're trying to get them to think about it more in terms of, is it relevant? Is it significant? So we mentioned earlier contextual information, what could we include? Would we introduce it at the beginning, or could we interweave it within the answer? Can we bring in some form of context at the end of the essay in our sort of final response to the prompt or the question? And thinking about how we'd answer these prompts. If it's relevant, yes. Preferably, we'd interweave it. And for D, we'd use context at the end, once again, if it's relevant and if we can make it reflect on the key terms of the question. So looking at desire, a candidate might have to actually define for us what they mean by desire. And if we look at that particular question, candidates enjoyed responding. It was a flexible concept and most people did explore the range of desires. So they would look at the idea that actually maybe Othello's chief desire is to be accepted by Venice, maybe even more so than love of Desdemona. And we can look possibly at that moment in Act 4 where he's kind of interrogating her. His language is degrading. He's using terms that have been influenced by Iago. And there's points where his reputation is addressed before his actual relationship and fidelity. So there is a sense that there is possibly some proof for that reading. And then also looking at the desires of the secondary characters such as Cassio and Rodrigo, and then maybe thinking about Desdemona in terms of her desires and how that develops or changes throughout the play. Candidates who stayed with the idea of desire in terms of romantic or sexual desire, it's potentially limiting, although it is still possible to write a level 5 if it remains nuanced and sustained, but it's a sense of getting candidates to have confidence to dictate the terms. If the word is desire, what might we mean by that? And then we go through with whether it's a destructive force. And looking at AO3, we can begin initially by desire in tragedy. So we're looking at the context of genre, thinking about where might it fit, what part does it play. Some students take it possibly further back than we possibly need. So we're giving here an example of we might not need to go as far as Aristotle and Seneca, but a sense of how Shakespeare adapts the genre of tragedy to fit with his concerns. And we could fit that in with thematics. So we don't necessarily need an entire history of tragedy, but we might look at what Shakespeare is doing with the genre and maybe how he's innovating with it. We could look at discussions of hamartia, and what we want to do is we don't want to just label it. We want to think about interrogating it and to what extent, that model is following through. You could look at desire in terms of religious or cultural contexts and think back to that sort of prejudicial language of Brabantio and think about where they focus desire as a form of witchcraft or as something deviant. And that again could be valid to the question. What we're going to do now, I'm going to allow you a little bit of time to conduct a marking activity. So in terms of the delegate resources, you will need the mark scheme. Ultimately, if you can turn to page 15 and 16, that's the marking grid. So we have our levels and our performance descriptors. And if you find script A in the delegate pack, it's a complete answer to question 1. I'll just pop a version of it on the screen in a moment so you can see the question that we're referring to. And we're not asking a definitive mark, but by all means you can give one if you feel like it, but we're asking which level would you put the response in. So I'll just come out for a moment. And it should be script A in your delegate pack. And it's the question on desire. So it's question 10. And I'll allow you a few moments with this one. So if you want to take 5 minutes to read through, and then either in chat or using your microphone, at minute 47, we'll maybe think about the level that you would place this response. And in terms of what we need, if you focus primarily on the mark scheme on pages 15 and 16, we're looking at performance indicators across the AO. And you'll see at the top, it tells you that the bullet points correspond. So bullet point 1 deals with AO1, bullet point 2 deals with AO2, bullet points 3 and 4 focus on AO3, and then AO5 bullet point 5. And just a small note on that, we use those bullet points to separate assessment objectives to help steer or place an answer, but we certainly don't allocate set marks. So we don't say the essay is worth this much, therefore give this many marks. So we've got to be very clear. It is holistic marking. So we are just looking to roughly place within a level at first, and then think about a refinement. Think about, would it be lower, secure, or high within that level? I'll give you those few moments. We'll have a feedback at 47, 48. And the full script is in resources. Yes, Liz, I have my thoughts with paragraphs. I think what we do with students is we do encourage them to think about how paragraph control does form part of the argument. So often I will reflect it back on the candidate and I will say, do have a look, do consider about controlling the argument, and do consider where we are moving to a new point. Yes, the idea is well arranged. Just an interesting case you've taken here. You'll see in a moment when we look at the comments that we do accept that within the time conditions that there may be limitations on range, but we look at what the candidate has given us. So we're not there to take away. We're going to look at what they have provided us with, and then we'll think about that in terms of what level does it reach. So we're always looking to see where it would be placed in terms of what it is doing. You know, it's that idea of what we call the catch them doing well. So it's not a case that we would penalise because we don't see a fellow omitted. It might seem strange to us that he has been omitted, but we must sort of mark what is there, not what is not there. Any other thoughts? So remember, we're not asking you necessarily to pinpoint to a mark, but if everyone would like to share the level they think it might have reached. Are we thinking level 3? Are we thinking clear and relevant with some logical structure? Is there some knowledge of how meanings are shaped? Is there a sense of the links to context being relevant? Is there a sense of any interpretation? Or are we thinking we have enough here for 4? Have we got any evidence of a controlled argument or fluent embedded examples? Is there a sense of discrimination occurring? We did mention earlier omissions, so to speak, and then rather than thinking of omissions, we're thinking of have they been discriminatory? Have they actually chosen certain examples? Claire raises an issue about, do we feel this has been a bit pre-prepared? Does it fit the question as well as it could? Contextually significant. So do please pose your thoughts. The idea of do we feel there's an element of pre-preparedness? Having said that you feel there's an omission of characters, do we see it as a flaw or do we see it as an evidence of discrimination? Do we think there's any detail emerging? Okay, so Liz is going for level 4. The idea that we do have control, we do have some detail of context. So we're just leading towards the well-deserved well-being break now. So if we could maybe just have a few more thoughts in terms of where people would place this, and then we'll just go through what it eventually achieved. Not necessarily a mark, but if you'd place it in a level, where would you go? Okay, so again, you felt there was a bit too much of a focus on the characters and not enough of the desire, which was the key term of the question. Any other thoughts? Yeah, teaching the difference between level 4 and level 5 is we'll be talking about that. I think you've read my mind. So I think we will be looking at how do we maneuver 4 to 5. Any more takers? So we have a level 4. If we were going to say, if we think it's 4, do we think it's just into level 4 insecurely? Do we think it's mid? Do we think it's secure? And I won't ignore that point, by the way, Liz. We will return to it very soon. so, okay, so if we've not sort of had a chance to work through or to maybe sort of take a level, considering it is nearly 1,500 words written under a timed response, it's sustained in that aspect. The student has actually managed to write quite a lot. Sometimes when it's typed, it can look slightly less, but if you remember, this is a handwritten exam response, and we are part of the AS part of the qualification. They have sustained their view. And yes, we have spotted some flaws, haven't we? So what we said is we have spotted some things we might not be happy with if we were the teacher of this particular candidate, but we must not overweight that. We must not result in what we call negative marking, marking for what's not there. We must mark what is there. Yes, it achieved a 4. There are elements of the answer that we would say are discriminating application. So if we accept that they're dealing with these characters, they've made a discrimination and they've chose some precise examples at times. The argument is mainly controlled. You did draw attention to the long paragraph, but we mainly have a control and we mainly have embedded examples. There are some cohesive transitions and some chosen language. Now, the errors are to do with haste. It is a bit galling when you say the capitals missed, but we again have a sense that it can be, typing under stress, typing under duress. So if they're not sort of impeding communication, we sort of look at those as what we call the typo. There is some discriminating understanding of how many needs are shaped. Now it is emerging, so it's not, I don't know how you felt if you're placing with a mark, we're not going very high in the level because of these elements of flaws that we've identified. We definitely think there are qualities of level 4, but we're feeling that it's not concrete or secure level 4. There are flashes and there are examples of detailed links, there are examples of controlled argument, there are examples of discrimination, but we do also then have those issues that you raised that would cause problems. So in fact, this one, it just achieved it. This one was given a mark of 16. So we felt it did enough to get into 4, but just into level 4 for some of the reasons that you've raised in the chat box. There were elements, potentially you said an issue with range, and certainly an issue with sort of sustaining that level of control of the argument. But what we felt were there were some key ingredients that we could push further. And now to address Liz's question, what could we do to take it to the level 5? And if we're thinking of the 5, certainly we're looking for that cogency, which we hope would come from a good sturdy plan. So the cogency of argument is knowing where you want to end up with your argument. It's being able to interweave your context throughout your response, so that if you note an element, for example, of language, you possibly link it to dramatic function, you possibly then look for a relevant or significant contextual link. So you can say, possibly I will look at the soliloquy, and that in itself is a context point to do dramatic function. You might look at certain words being used by a character, and then you might consider thematic links, and it's totally interwoven. It's cohesive, it's cogent. The argument is hitting all of the AOs all the time. And that's sort of the quality of the 5. So you might ask the student to look at their paragraphs. Yes, the level 5 personal response has a key extra word, critical. So it's a personal critical or a personal sophisticated response. So the personal view is there, but it's very much informed. It's been informed by their understanding of the genre. It's been informed by their understanding of social context, religious contexts, and their own definition, as you said, the idea of defining desire, for example. So maybe formatting or framing that as a way of looking at the argument. And that would be the quality of the 5. If we just very briefly look at the level 5 part of the mark scheme, we are looking at critical evaluative. We wouldn't write I. So be very careful. When we say personal response, it doesn't necessarily need to have the word I. And it comes through in their answer. I know, Naomi, it's quite sort of frustrating, isn't it? They believe that personal response must have an I. We can have the I without the pronoun, so we can actually sort of have that idea of the student's view coming across, sometimes with a degree of confidence, without them having to state the I, so they can kind of neutralize it, but still very clearly be getting their point across. And it's that key. And certainly it's the idea of it's a critical evaluation. So they're not frightened. They can be confident to put their own point of view across, but they are certainly backing it up either with sustained examples, or they're looking at an understanding of writer's craft, or again, if we see here, the key to the 5, going back to that point that you raised, Liz, about what is the difference. not only are we raising contexts and interpretations in effective ways, but actually you have the confidence to begin to evaluate them as well. You know, do we think this particular context is relevant and a useful way of exploring the theme of the question? And you'll see that, you'll see the five straight away, because they're already managing to talk about the how. They're talking about that broader framework, you know, what is happening beyond the world of the play in terms of its reception. And then they're actually not afraid to challenge both the terms of the question and then actually sort of the relevance or the significance of certain contexts as a way of understanding either a character or a theme or a part of dramatic function. And does that sort of clear it up? The idea that everyone ideally, certainly from our sort of level 3 and beyond, should be trying to integrate that context, integrate that idea of other critical interpretations with our own. And then what gets us to a 4 is the degree of control of that material and the discrimination, which is the key word. So it's learning not to talk about everything, but actually choosing your examples wisely to illustrate a particular argument. And then level 5 is doing all of that and then having that critical confidence to evaluate every aspect of those AOs. So not only evaluating language, but evaluating say the relevance or the usefulness of a particular context, and even the relevance or usefulness of the prompt that they've been given in the question. It's not necessarily saying we always argue against it, but we can look at it and we can really drill down to some of those words. And I think you'll be pleased to hear at this point, we are at the halfway point, and it might be a good time for a well-being break to give everyone a chance to get a refreshment or to kind of think through those few activities that we've looked at so far. If we say that we will reconvene at 10 minutes past, we'll make our way through towards section B. What I would suggest as well, if there are some pressing questions, because at the end, you know, we can feel a bit rushed, and I know some of you maybe are on a very sort of tight timeline. If there's some pressing questions that you'd like to pop into the chat box over the break, and then I'll have a quick look at those. And if there's anything we need to address before moving into section B, we can do that before moving forward. So do please take a break and give yourself a small rest. And then if there's something that you'd like me to consider or review, if you want to just pop it into the chat box, and then we can maybe look at those questions at the halfway point for section A, and then it just gives us some room to do questions for section B at the end. And thank you for your attention and concentration so far, and I'll see you in 10 minutes. Just like to welcome everyone back. Don't panic if you're still finishing your tea or your coffee. I'll just go through some of the questions during the break and some really good sort of probing questions in terms of things that we can say to candidates and advice that we can give them about the text. So a few issues raised, and thank you, Liz, we've raised things that we could sort of look at. The idea of talking to candidates about engaging with a critical opinion, and how do they do that? You know, are they going to use quotation, or are they going to try and articulate the viewpoint from a whole article or perspective? And as you've mentioned, we don't want students to feel like they're having to do some rote learning. Questions about socio-historic context and dates, and questions about where we're looking at secondary sources, drawing on literary and historical sources, how we would sort of deal with those, how we'd incorporate those. And also a question there about text in production. So I think those are really useful and really helpful questions. So I'll go through those one by one just before we start back in on section B. Critical opinion, we've been saying previously with AO3, and the same would apply for AO5, we really want to have a sense of it being interwoven within the student's personal response. So we're really hoping for and aiming for that meaningful and relevant use of the critical opinion. And we see candidates address it in both ways. We do see candidates who are able to take those very pertinent short quotations or references from a secondary critical reading. We do have candidates who will provide a very brief overview or essay of someone's opinion or perspective. And both of those, or a combination, have been seen with good, effective level 4, level 5 responses. And we try and advise candidates against rote learning, sort of huge chunks or lengthy quotations, because in turn that can lend to the bolt-on. That can lend to a student who sort of spent many hours trying to learn these various perspectives, and then they're so adamant that they have to try and get them into the answer somewhere. Whereas if we say to them, just be aware of these perspectives, or be able to explain them or evaluate them, or if you have those very short, pertinent quotes to do with a particular perspective, those usually work much more fluidly in a cogent response. Looking at if they do make a small mistake, and we do see some quite major mistakes. We do see candidates occasionally citing things by several hundred years in the wrong direction. But certainly if a candidate is placing the date and they make a small error with the date, we're not looking to do negative marking. We're not looking to penalise if they haven't got the date quite right. And one thing you might suggest, if they're referring to, for example, with Elizabeth's Act and Prejudice, if they know the name of the act, that would be one way. We'd be clear at what they're referencing. And likewise, if they're a little bit uncomfortable or unsure, as long as it's clear the context that's being referenced, that is key. And if we were to be a year or 2 or 5 out, it's not going to be penalised. And also the sense of other materials, and you mentioned Machiavelli or Cynthia, would look at some students can quite freely reference, and they can be quite flexible, but we're certainly not expecting that. But if they were sort of naming that secondary source and bringing it in, once again, in a relevant way, so it's not maybe necessary for particular questions, but it might be necessary in other questions, it's enough to reference that source. And once again, why are they referencing it? What do they think it brings to the answer? What do they think it illuminates? And then with text in production, it very much depends on the point the candidate is trying to make. So it might be a point to do with costume design, which is at text level, but it may also be something quite specific. It might be the particular delivery of a significant line, or it may be that idea of that proxemics and the staging and the positioning of characters in a particular key scene. So with the reference to the text in production, maybe rather than general, if they can think about an example that really stayed in their mind, they felt that the way that particular scene was addressed. With the Pearson, if you want to sort of work with Claire, I think sometimes it's she'll talk you through about the marking, and she'll sort of talk through about the sort of candidates and the entries for that one. Anyone else then, before we move through, questions about AO3 in section A, or generally issues, the little niggles that we have with candidates and we can't seem to get them out of certain practices? And don't worry, if you miss it now, we'll have a brief opportunity at the end. So we'll work our way through. So we've done part A, and we're moving through to look through now at part B. And when we're thinking about part B, we're now moving towards our modern texts. So we're looking here at the texts that have maybe a wider range of techniques, but again, you're sort of addressing one text, you're working with one text. So we'll have a look and just remind ourselves of what's been tested in section B. AO3 again is quite prevalent here, so we're looking at sort of bringing it right to the foreground and how we might do it. We're looking at post-1900, so we are looking at Raisin in the Sun. Don't see as many of these as we'd like to, actually. I really sort of enjoy Raisin in the Sun. I think it's a great play with lots of conflict and key moments, but we see a few, but not many. Streetcar Named Desire, Death of Salesman, and then we have Top Girls and Waiting for Godot. We'll look at Streetcar and Death of Salesman are quite popular, and then we do see some, and we'd like to see some more on some of the other choices. As before, choice of 2, and candidates pick 1, and it's an essay-based response. You can notice here it's the same structure as with the Shakespeare section. We have our prompt, which will engage thinking and positioning of the personal response. We have the core of the question, which is what we're asking the candidate to do. And again, that reminder to include those contextual factors. So for our Death of Salesman, we have these 2 options. we have a place where characters long for respect of others, but ultimately fail to achieve it. And the question is on presentation of respect. And looking at how we might interrogate the question, it's the idea of someone longing for, so evidence that they desire the respect of others, and then equally evaluating at the ending, do they ultimately fail to achieve it? So it gives students a bit of direction. They may choose to, as we say, argue against, but it suggests that they might look at how those characters develop and then have maybe a focus on the resolution and how it would either prove or disprove those points. Number 16 is the world in which honesty is rare and often unwelcome. And again, this sense of, like we had with the desire question, we might have to define what we mean by honesty. Is it sort of honesty with oneself? Is it honesty with others? Is it in a professional sphere? So candidates can have room there to present certain definitions of frames, and then we would evaluate that idea of rarity or whether it is welcomed or unwelcome. And the question then being presentation of honesty. And with these, we hope by using the word presentation that candidates constantly keep the dramatic function and staging in the foreground of these answers. So looking at the honesty question, thinking about it, it's the how. And I think Novi mentioned in section A, keep telling candidates how. How is it being done? And then go on to explore the effect. And that is something that candidates still err on the wrong side of. If it is a thematic question, we get a sense of what, and we might get a series of examples of where honesty is presented, but not the how it's presented. And then looking at the first part, the sense of the discussion that we might have around it. So we do the second informed by the first. Once again, we're thinking as we go through, what might the opening and closing lines be? Are they thinking about how, and possibly what should they avoid or what could they adopt when they're planning or writing? So thinking about planning and thinking about revising, we have no specified method. We are not saying one is better than another. We certainly tell candidates to avoid what we call re-narrating or narration. So particularly if they're looking at examples from very distant parts of the play, they must avoid the urge to fill in the gaps and tell us everything that's happened in between. It's fine to sort of move through those examples, but just locate them quite specifically at certain points. So if you can locate it at a certain point in the narrative, you don't need to tell us everything that's gone in between. Some candidates carry over the formats that they've used from GCSE, from IGCSE, and we see various versions of this, Pebble, Forest, PQE. We don't necessarily discourage, but we sometimes find if candidates stay religiously with that, it may not be as effective at AS and A level. If they're very strictly staying within that structure, they sometimes miss opportunities to bring in the context or the critical interpretation, or to do that embedding that we talked about earlier. How is language an aspect of dramatic function, for example? So candidates will find their way. They might find that these formats are useful to them in the early days when they're trying to gain confidence in presenting their views, but then they need to be encouraged to maybe step away from those a little bit and work through presenting those individual arguments about the particular question. Opening and closing lines can be very important. We want a candidate to provide a position. If they can give a position that they hold on the main question, it's already showing personal response from the outset. And we want to move beyond just literally using the terms from the question. We do want to see that there are terms from the question throughout the answer and that the candidates are staying focused and on task. But if we just get a reiteration, so an appearance reality question, if they say, I've been asked to write about appearance and reality, it's not really giving us a sense of their interpretation of its significance in a text. So if they can start from, as we say, the get-go, giving us, say, a point of view, not necessarily a fully fledged thesis, but a point of view on, I think this is how this aspect is significant. So if we took something like an appearance and reality, we do refer back to the terms, but we're thinking about how to address the task. We're saying possibly avoid linear models with these questions because they lead candidates into a narrative approach. If they purely deal with things in a chronological order, they may fall into narrative. So thinking about other ways of organizing the material, possibly through maybe focusing on techniques of function, possibly maybe through focusing on context. So ways of organizing their information so that they don't slip into retelling the story. Points that we look at was mentioned section A: imagery, symbols, motifs, the voice and dialogue, and other aspects of staging. We know in some texts that the technical aspects such as staging, music and lighting are actually relevant to the way the story is told. We do suggest that the word level analysis can be less useful here. And that's a reference across both from the prose and the drama text, but we can look at how ideas and motifs are developed across a play if we tend to get into just focusing on a word or a particular technique in a very small section without linking it to other sections of the play. And it's not going to take candidates beyond that level 3. They're certainly demonstrating that they can make clear and relevant points, but they're not getting too controlled and discriminating. And there are ways of planning. Some candidates are visual planners and they may prefer a mind map. And personally, I'm a bullet pointer, but different ways of planning, but it's as long as they can visualize where they're going. And moving to the other popular text, Streetcar Named Desire, we have the question on the complexities of Blanche's character. And we do need to be careful with these protagonists such as Blanche. And we are trying to look at, in particular, what we would call the complexities, or the prompt calls her contradictions. And what we try to avoid is a very sort of straightforward or narrative approach of looking at the character. We're trying to look at the dramatic function and presentation of those complexities. And they give you a bit of a steer in the prompt. You may be looking at elements of her character that are portrayed as deeply intolerant, and you may be then comparing and contrasting it to moments where she is portrayed as extremely vulnerable. And again, we're looking at the word portrayed. How is that brought across, both through language and dramatic performance? And the sense of her being, again, full of contradictions. This candidate can challenge that. Do they believe that's the best way of reading the character? Moving on to 18, we have a question on dramatic impact of telling truth. And again, it's the dramatic impact of the truth. So not just necessarily the consequences of when the truth is revealed, but the impact it might have on audiences. So you're probably looking there at the key reveals, the scene where Stanley exposes Blanche, or the scene where she is working with Mitch. We're thinking not just of, as we say, the actual truth-telling and what it means for the characters within the world of the play, but the dramatic impact. How is it placed on stage, and how might the audience respond? How does it influence an audience response at that point? And again, notice the prompt says depicts a world. We're aware that it's a constructed world, and we're thinking about the world that Williams is trying to show us and the difficulties they are finding to tell the truth. And if we're looking at context or critical interpretations, we might broaden that out into the message or the purpose of this creation of this world. What interpretation could we place on it? So looking at using the prompt to help you answer. If the question is on complexities of Blanche's character, the candidate could have used the words intolerant, vulnerable, and contradiction to help structure some of their response. There may be a slight unbalance, so we do remind them they are answering the core question. They are answering the question on complexities. So the prompt is there to help them, but they must remember it is a prompt and they still have a key question. It may lead them to speculate. So it's saying it may lead them to consider their position regarding the prompt, but then use that to answer the main part. There are many parts where she is, as we say, intolerant and vulnerable, but you may introduce fresh terms. So the candidate may feel that those terms do not fully cover her complexities, and they may include or shape the answer, for example, talking about when she's manipulative and scheming. If they're using a broader approach, that would be fine as long as this is explained as part of the argument. So it says, thinking carefully about the first, rather than just agreeing with it, can help differentiate the answer. So if, for example, your candidate felt that that prompt was too possibly simplistic to describe lunch, particularly when the question is about complexities, it is key to challenge it. So they can challenge the position and present their perspective. So looking at the keywords, and we're thinking about the truth question. So keywords that might help, we said earlier about how do we get students from, say, level 4 to level 5, and it's this interrogation of prompt that might help them do so. They could have picked the word difficult to tell the truth. And we're thinking about either examples of characters who do not find it difficult and the dramatic effect of that, and then equally for those who do find it difficult, how is that presented and how do we know? This would bring us into the critical response. So you could, at the most basic level, access AO5 by simply arguing with the prompt. And that's a point maybe for those candidates who are struggling maybe to achieve in the higher levels, as long as they make sure they've engaged with the prompt, that is at its most basic level, evidence of AO5. We've given an interpretation of the prompt and they have engaged with that. Obviously, we'd like the candidates to do much more, but it does enable a basic engagement with AO5. So with those candidates who are finding it a challenge, we make sure that they at least engage with that prompt, and that will give evidence of the AO5 in the response. Because as we move on to, it's the absence of some AOs that can be detrimental to the final mark. So what can we talk about when we talk about context? Some of them do overlap with critical response, and we're aware of that, but we are looking at where we can credit. So they may consider the writer's life and think about place and time, but only where it relates to the text and ideally where it relates to the question. So the best response is keep it relevant to question. As before, we might think about the literary context of the text. Is it from a certain literary movement or in terms of the historical concerns of the time, if it matches concerns of other texts? Context of reception. So they may look at historical reviews of, say, first performances. In the case of Streetcar, we often get the response to Stanley's Assault. We might look at how those maybe are edited or changed in time. It could be, as we said earlier, staging or a film or a television adaptation. And then also the readers and obviously the literary critics. So looking at those literary or more academic responses. So other things they might show us. They understand that there are a range of ways to read or experience the text. We know the text is more than words on the page. They can evaluate the text in terms of interpretations by other audiences and readers. And it might be merely comparing the audience at the time to the modern audience, or it might be a much more nuanced understanding of reception in different places and times. It might be the idea of response to attitudes and values. And similarly, it might be contemporary versus modern. So there can be a lot of information for candidates to process. I think, Liz, you raised it with your students and the AO3. There's a lot of things for them to keep in mind. And it may be difficult for some to assimilate and internalize this as well as answer the question effectively. There are ways we can introduce them to the critical and contextual knowledge. So we can do this ourselves. We can encourage them to look at audiovisual resources. So an example here is someone has mentioned for Death of a Salesman, an interview with Arthur Miller discussing his career holistically. You may sort of set students research or presentation tasks in the early stages so that they sort of engage with context alongside engaging with the play. And then those types of revision activities where you might ask them to design quizzes, flashcards, etc. So looking at how they can research. So one of the problems you might have may be the size of the cohort, and we are aware of that. So it may be that if we don't have enough students, we can't sort of make a meaningful use of group activity and feedback. It may be that we have some very shy candidates or reliability of what they've chosen to present. We certainly don't want them to be presenting undoctored AI, for example. It may be that if a student is less confident, we get over shyness by asking them to record and play. And students can get quite good at that. They sort of take a pride in their recording and they'll have several attempts at it. And in fact, what you get as a final product can be very effective compared to putting them on the spot live in front of the class. We can get students to fact check each other before the final presentation. And again, it's just that we give them some independent ownership over the work, but a degree of gatekeeping so that we know that what they're sharing with the group is meaningful and useful. So thinking about what they could research. Now here's a list of some things, and what I'd like you to think about is maybe other possible approaches or other possible areas to look at. So depending on your play, this may be different, but thinking about possibilities. Depending on the text, you may be looking at gendered readings, for example, feminist interpretations of your particular text. We did say earlier we want to avoid things like a Marxist critic says, but nevertheless, it can be meaningful to look at different types of criticisms from different periods of time, particularly if we're comparing contemporary and modern responses to the text. The biographicist and psychoanalytic critiques we do use, but we'd say let's balance them with care. What we want to do is we don't want the interpretation driving the text to the point where the candidate's not thinking about dramatic function. So we don't want sort of solely become, for example, a psychoanalytical reading. It needs to still be a drama analysis. It needs to look at the text as a play and maybe using elements of these to illustrate a highlight point. Depending on what you study, you can make reference from maybe more esoteric points of view. So eco-critical theory, which is maybe a newer field, we've seen that at times applied to Death of a Salesman, particularly focusing into Willie and the seeds and his reference about nothing grows here anymore, and the idea of sort of encroaching urbanization and the impact on the community and on society. So there is a possibility of taking an eco-critical theoretical approach to something like Death of a Salesman. And as I've said with psychoanalytic, it may not stand up as the sole approach to take, but a candidate might balance or evaluate various ways of reading the text. Structuralist approach may work well with a text, for example, like Waiting for Godot, and you might equally find that post-colonialism is an interesting approach to text where maybe we take some values as accepted and given, but we look at it through another lens and we might get some, another interpretation through. Candidates are not going to be able to put everything in a response, so having practiced and worked through them in class, they're going to think about which approaches are more relevant or more significant to the types of questions they're answering. And just looking at that list, would anyone like to add in the text box any other approach that you've maybe already taken with students or that you consider, maybe with your particular text? So we've looked here at the Miller and at the Williams, but depending on whatever text you've done, have you found sort of other sort of fields of study or critical approaches to be useful or helpful with your candidates? Again, I'll just give you a moment to maybe pop those in the chat box. Just maybe you may have thought of something that maybe other delegates or ourselves have not. And we're summarising here today for our own sake, but we do try and encourage candidates not to sort of write the paragraph, a Marxist critic says, a psychoanalytical critic says, because that's where we get into the ropes and bolt-ons and not using that meaningful interweaving that we mentioned earlier. And so it's quite harsh. We're doing it to simplify the list, but we try and ask the students not to. Yes, the queer theory, as you said, the streetcar, and the idea of looking at that, basing it in history and what was happening. And particularly if we're looking at then Stanley in the post-war context, we can start sort of thinking about that, and we can even think about it in terms of him then maybe standing for this American identity. And the key is to encourage them to experiment, to encourage them to look at it from different points. Actual productions will come in. In fact, it's one of those flexibilities. Depending nearly on how the student uses it, the actual production can either be assessed as AO3 or AO5, depending on what the candidate has done. So if they've looked at it as broadly a context of reception, for example, that might go in AO3. But if they actually use that production to say, here's an interpretation I saw, and it gave a really interesting explanation for character X's motivation, then it begins to become AO5. The production itself, as you said, becomes a critical interpretation. So we're thinking there of where the director has taken a very clear choice in how they've read the text. And then if the candidate is using that version and sort of explaining or evaluating how that sheds new lights on a particular topic, that then would be credited AO5. If it's used in a sort of more traditional way and saying, well, I saw this and this shows us, you know, how men or women were treated in say, Shakespeare's time, that would fit in an AO3. So it's one of those interesting ones, isn't it? But certainly we would encourage comments on production, and it just depends on how the candidate uses it as to what it would be kind of credited for. And we do try and keep an open mind. You know, when we're looking at it, it's you're looking at a point and you're thinking, particularly if a candidate is looking maybe slightly thin on AO5, we might say, actually, is this an AO5 point? Are they making a critical point about the way they've seen this text performed? And that would be it. But certainly if they're in there, that is all good. It's when that's an absent that we have an issue. And once again, in terms of where students are going, they may use something like Google Scholar as a starting point. It may be depending on the centre that there may be a subscription to JSTOR or e-magazines. And there's a slightly tongue-in-cheek remark there about books, so, it's good old books. The AI slide, it's not being included today, but AI, if we just pause with this for a moment, because I know on one hand it can be the bane of our lives as we try to work out how much belongs to a student and how much has been generated elsewhere, but there can be a place for AI in the revision period. There can be a place for students, particularly those who maybe are less confident, to try and hone prompts that they give to an AI, not necessarily to look for an entire essay, but those words that we talked about, those words that we might debate from the first prompt in the question. And if they sort of use AI to generate maybe a series of 5 or 6 ideas relating to that prompt, it just opens up their personal interpretation. So I'm thinking about those candidates who are finding it challenging, so level 2, level 3, and you're making it clear to them this is not a format for an essay, but you can say to them they could use the AI as a prompt if they're looking at words to do with desire, and you need to get them to open up, for example, their understanding of the term desire. It's a good first step, and they can use it as a skeleton plan. They can then evaluate that plan and hopefully pick it to pieces. And what we want them to realize is that the AI is never going to produce the sort of thing that's going to get the marks. It's there as a starting point to maybe get them to think of ideas relating to a prompt that they may not have thought of. So it's a very sort of basic revision tool that they can use independently when not in class to address some of the past paper questions. And I think that's the place for it. That's the safe place for it. And you can actually show students how to do that. So you might put the prompt in, say, for example, about the complexities of Blanche. It's going to throw back maybe 300, 400 words in 5 or 6 parts telling you about some aspects of her character. And you emphasize to the students, look, this is step 1. This is giving you some aspects to think about her character. What would you agree with? What would you disagree with? So it can be a tool for those candidates who often sit with blank page syndrome and just never know how to start. But you make it very clear to them nothing they're going to produce on there is going to get them anywhere near the levels they want to go, because it doesn't do well with structuring sophisticated argument, and it just pulls points from various places, so it's very disjointed. But it can have a role as a revision tool for them and as an independent study tool early in the course. Film and TV, we've mentioned, is perfectly acceptable as examples of performance here for, as we said, both AO3 and AO5. And if you can get to see a staging, I mean, that's fantastic. If a student can have a performance that they've watched from start to finish and be engaged in, that's ideal, but we know that can't always be the case. Looking at the engagement, the AO5, we just need it there. And certainly for those of you this morning and the responses you've been putting in the text box, it's clear that you're doing that with your candidates. We have examples sometimes those centres where we're not seeing evidence of that AO3 and AO5, and then that's going to have a really detrimental effect on that grade. So AO5 at its absolute most basic level is the candidate engaging with that primary prompt. That is an interpretation, and if they engage with it, challenge it, or show an interaction with it, that's a very basic level, and we're using that word basic. We know we're talking level 1, level 2, but it's evidence it's there. 3 and above, we really must be, as we say, using those external sources. We need to be getting familiar with critical interpretations. We need to be using those socio-historical contexts, but thinking about how critics either of the time or of modern time can help us. And we do sort of need to see it explicit, but not bolt on. So the very highest marks, it needs to be there, but it needs to be relevant to the question. And looking with the criticism, how they're using it, I've said already, it's for the question, it's for developing a line of argument. And like we said with the prompt itself, the best candidates are not afraid to use a view that they don't wholly agree with. So the best candidates are actually quite confident in taking the critical interpretation, saying to what extent they support it, but then actually looking for evidence of where they feel they can challenge it or they can present their own alternative reading. And that's really showing the absolute best work. It's showing an awareness of the text itself. It's showing an awareness of dramatic technique. It's showing an awareness of how you can use critical interpretations to illuminate your understanding and to further your evaluation of the work. Looking at more than one interpretation of a given idea is another approach. So that's an approach some candidates take as well. So they will take maybe a key scene or a key element that they feel needs examination, and they'll consider it from multiple perspectives. And we said already, so I'm not sort of over egg, but the idea of they've got to try and use those perspectives and avoid placing them just in the end of an argument. So often we do see candidates who either are panicking about time issues and they really want to show us what they've done, and they will sometimes tag on the AO5 onto the end of a paragraph when it's not really integrated, or even at the end of the essay. So they're sort of trying to hit the target, but not in a meaningful way. We've said that digging deep of the statement will help them get that interwoven characteristic in their answer. And then the idea of returning to those points and having a line of argument so that their argument does begin to address the prompt and does bring in the key terms of the question throughout. It then gives us another opportunity for some marking. And we have here this time section B marking. It's script B, and we'll need for that pages 27 and 28 of the mark scheme. And script B is a complete answer to question 17. And we are going to, as before, put it in an appropriate level. And certainly, I think people's feelings were sort of level 4 last time. And if we can see, as many delegates as possible, sort of popping up a level there. And if you do feel this time like giving it a mark within that level, thinking about, has it just achieved it? Is it secure? And is it actually moving towards with elements of the next level, in which case it's going to be right near the top. And we're going to look at script B. And as we've said, if we give 5 minutes to peruse it, read it, focus on the mark scheme on pages 27 and 28 of the larger scheme. And then if we can sort of pop those responses into the chat box. And once again, we'll sort of look at the answer at the end. And it's from script B rather than script A. So I'll just bring that one up. It's not the Othello response, it's the modern drama, post 1900. So we have a streetcar named Desire. And if we review what has been written in the chat box at 10:50. Just briefly, want to interrupt your thoughts. As we said before, remember the candidates are under time, so we can bear that in mind with some of the typing errors. And if we want to just, the delegates suggest a level just in the chat box, get an idea of where you're thinking this would be placed. You can add a comment if you wish, or just simply place the level that you think. Yeah. Thoughts? What we can do, I'm glad to see actually that Victor did take it to 5. It actually achieved a 4, but at the very top of 4. So I'm glad that actually, Victor, when you gave the 5, you were sort of recognizing that there were flashes of sort of possible level 5 performance in it. And it was felt ultimately that it was high secure level 4 and achieving a 19. So certainly there were those few flashes, and in fact, I'd be happy if it was on the team. I'd be so pleased that you're going to 21. It wouldn't bother me the slightest. It did end up gaining the mark of 19 in the senior team because purely it's a case of consistency, but certainly what it confidently did to get 19 marks is it definitely sustained the idea, and it gained, sorry, Liz, a 19. So it didn't quite achieve level 5. It achieved a secure level 4. So you're able to hear that. Or if there is, apologies to all of you if there is a bit of static leaking into my microphone. Hopefully, is that a little bit better? So, is that a little clearer for everyone now? Still have some static. Okay, so apologies. I'm having a few tech issues with the mic. I'll just maneuver it and see if we can do something else with it now. Okay, so it's a little bit better, but not as good as before. What we'll hopefully do, because we are coming into the closing sections, I will try and soldier on, and hopefully you will be able to hear me to an extent. Perfect. It's I think I might need a new microphone. So anyway, we'll see, and hopefully this won't be too problematic. So just in case we missed that, it achieved a mark of 19. Going back to Victor's mark, we did feel there were occasional flashes of level 5, but they were maybe not consistent enough to warrant the level 5. So I think what we had was it came out with a mark of 19. It's a controlled argument, certainly with fluent examples. It was discriminating and certainly dealing with some of the nuances and subtleties, and had detailed links. Now, if we think about why it maybe didn't reach the 5, it could have warranted more technical focus, more focus on this as a dramatic performance. There could have been a degree of more specific detail on the context and less general in places. There could have been more concision in the expression. So again, if there's points where it really didn't have that precision, it just took it down a little. And it could possibly have addressed more to do with stagings, but overall a strong response at 19 and just needing those few tweaks, those few improvements to reach the level 5. And sorry for all of those who thought it was the headset. I have a microphone that has no problems, and this morning it decided to develop some static. So thank you for bearing with me. We are coming towards the conclusion soon. So looking then at possible strategies for teaching, and there is this idea of the text explorer. And we're thinking about what that might look at. And at the lower levels, if we think of students as just visiting the text, they might find something and identify it, but it remains simple and it may not always be accurate. At level 2, they become not just a visitor, but a reviewer. They have things that may be unconnected and they might comment on them. At level 3, they become more secure and can identify and explain, but they often still work in a linear fashion and don't always make connections. At level 4, we have what we call the explorer. They can discriminate both in terms of evidence and how they use context. They can think about connecting to critical approaches, and they look closely at things and with attempts at evaluation. And then moving through to 5, we have the sense of a student finding the text engaging and stimulating. They are secure with their methodology, and there is a good sense of a discursive voice. They can evaluate issues, they can evaluate critical interpretations, they can present a nuanced approach to the question, and their journey is worthwhile. We mentioned in the beginning that there is the option to deliver this as both linear and modular, and we have there just the possible routes or possible permutations, and in fact there are ways of combining both within a centre. So looking at what you've done, you've marked and discussed possible approaches for AOs. You've thought about teaching strategies, and we've had some really helpful contributions from delegates. So thank you very much for sort of sharing experience and then sharing issues that you might have had. Looking at how Edexcel can support moving forward, there are a wide range of resources and support for different levels of the journey, whether it's planning the teaching and learning, the exam preparation and assessment, or the results support. We've got a series of materials online, and you can really drive down into that in terms of things like specification, past papers, and learning support materials for elements of the course. Results Plus is a service that will be offered that allows personalised results and analysis tools for teachers with their centre resources. And all of this is available on the Pearson website, and you can look for more information there. There is also Exam Wizard, which will enable people to make assignments and tests from previous papers. And the Access to Scripts resource allows centres access to their own scripts post-results. Being clear that for additional paid resources, we do not necessarily just need resources produced by Pearson. There are many resources out there on particular texts that you may be studying, and those are perfectly appropriate as well. There are textbooks developed specifically for the course, the AS and A-level English Literature Resource Pack and accompanying student books, and they have a very strong focus on the progression and transferable skills and can be accessed at www.pearsonglobalschools.com, and this is in your pack as well. And Claire, thank you for attending today. Claire is also available as subject advisor, and there's a series of contact details where you can contact Pearson for more information and further support on particular queries. So looking for the resources, many of these are available online or links online. There are also some texts we can see listed here, which can be useful as introductory texts to the literature course. At this point, as I did during the wellbeing break, firstly, I apologise if the static was ongoing. That is a new and unfortunate problem that has developed this morning. So I do thank you once again for being patient with it. I did say that if you wanted to type any specific query to do with a particular AO, with section A or section B, please feel free to type that in the chat box. At this point, I do thank you for giving your time today, and I hope that you got some useful information or some pause for thought for delivering Unit 2. And I would wish you a very good day wherever we are in the world, and allow you to take a much needed break. And thank you for your time once again, and patience with any ongoing static. So at this point, I will sort of close the general meeting. if before you log off, you want to pass on any pressing questions, I can gather those and I can forward those through. And likewise, I can remain on for a few extra minutes if anyone sort of wants to sort of raise a question or open the mic. So hopefully you can hear me reasonably clearly. I thank everyone once again for their time and their contributions. It's been lovely to work with you in the virtual space. And I will just pop my video back on one more time and stop share. And I would just like to sort of wish everyone a very good day wherever they may be. And thank you very much for your time. So I'll say goodbye for now and have a very good week.